Also some theory that I am actually very interested in looking at. We have basically this Staunton Gambit is what's up for tonight, and we can take a look. So Staunton Gambit is actually is a pretty interesting opening. It's basically one of White's kind of more aggressive mainline ways of playing against the against playing the Dutch. So basically D4, immediate F5, and then E4. This situation ends up being pretty good for White overall. E4, pawn takes E4, knight to C3, and knight to F6 are by far the two most common lines. At one point, this really played out very well for White. White had like a lot of wins out of this, in the early 1900s. At this point, I think that it's sort of a secondary line, but still, very interesting stuff. F3, this is the Blackmar's second gambit. Okay, I didn't know that's what that was called. Bishop to G5 is what I've seen the most frequently. And with bishop to G5, Black has a number of choices. So let's take a look. Let's open up the engine eval. And basically ideas for Black can include G6, C6, knight to C6. Yeah, I think Black's just overall, there's a number of different flexible ways that Black can deal with this. One thing that he can't do, though, is play D5. D5 is pretty straightforward error. On D5, bishop takes F6, and then queen to H5 on the following move. So that's just the one thing that Black can't do here if you're taking this from the Black side. Anyways, this knight to C6 is the most common. This knight to C6 is kind of awkward. It's basically the knight going in front of the C pawn, which is a little bit, difficult for Black. But anyways, White will follow up with D5, knight to E5, queen to E5, and knight to F7. This is interesting again. Basically, White's facing off against this, against these kinds of aligned knights. The F pawn and the E4 gambit don't really provide that much weakness for Black, to be completely honest. Basically, this knight on E5 going to F7, threatening this bishop. But yeah, overall, I think this is, I think this ends up being like fairly solid for Black. In fact, Black is showing an advantage here. Even with Black having extra development, this pawn will provide lasting weakness, and Black will have to make a choice about how to deal with the knight's threat on the bishop. So again, this is fine for Black. But yeah, so just the main lines of this gambit: knight to C3, knight to F6. And then four choices, four branches, or basically bishop to G5 being the most common, F3 being the most common, the most common continuing gambit line, and bishop to G5. After bishop to G5, knight to C6, E6, C6, and G6 all provide options for Black. Specific options. So basically, Black has a flexible position, cannot play D5 and E6, for example. This will end up in a situation where Black will be able to recapture the knight on F6, and the most common move by far here is knight takes E4, putting pressure on F6 again. Now bishop to E7, pretty much the only move. Bishop takes, knight to F3, B6. And basically here, Black has his bishop on the fianchetto file. Black can castle. Black can play bishop to B7, but a number of options for Black here. And with bishop to D3, I think I guess I would just say that White's position here is relatively solid. Development is Black is leading by a lot. There's no real weaknesses in terms of in terms of White's position, whereas Black basically has to worry about this open H5 file. So this is one of the lines that plays out better for White out of this gambit. As well as the pawn actually materially getting recaptured. That's important. We can take a look at this line, this F3 line. On F3, E takes F3, knight takes F3. And basically, this is a line where White has now sacrificed like a significant amount of material. Black can play something like D5 and C6 pretty safely. There's not going to be any threats with queen to H5. G6 is also available. Bishop to G4 is available. But basically here, I think Black should have a pretty comfortable position. C6, D5, E5. All of these plays for Black should lead to basically Black being safe. So. Ideas: E6, bishop to D3, bishop to E7, bishop to G5. Options here: C6, D6, castles, and D5. I think these are all good. White's getting quick development, and here White's up by about a pawn. So c6, castles, d6, queen to e2, and yeah, I guess I would just say white's development is favorable enough here that I would view the situation through that lens. This attack of e2 on e6, that's important. Knight to a6, important. Castles, important, and basically white's facing off against kind of a weakened black position. Black and castle here. I guess, I mean, the threat on e6 looks pretty serious. Hey, welcome, Jack Mac. Thank you very much for joining the stream. Yeah, we were just going over the Staunton Gambit, and I was interested in kind of looking over lines that people might be more interested in. E4, pawn takes e4. This basically equalizes for white. It's not at this point, it's not considered to be one of the more ambitious plays for white. Engine, interestingly, suggests f3. But that's a pretty distant second. So knight to c3, knight to f6, bishop to g5, knight to c6. Okay, I mean, this all looks fine. In terms of picking out the best opening, so here we're at kind of a point where we find ourselves at, relatively frequently, which is just we have a bunch of different options for black in a main line. This is a fork. And kind of what are we going to use to determine what to play out of this, basically out of this fork. Knight to c6 seems to have the best chances for black based on game strategy or based on past games. But other options for black include g6, knight to c6, and black has a few different options here. So I guess I would say knight to c6, probably the combination of these makes it the safest. G6 seems to get the best engine eval. But yeah, I would say the main line, knight to c6, provided it doesn't cause any objective problems here. Knight to c6 is probably the best way to play. D5, f3, bishop to f6, bishop to b5. All of these, yeah, this is a common attack against the Dutch, for sure. We can look, yeah, so basically e4 is defined as the Staunton Gambit. There are a few others. This g4 Gambit is interesting. But yeah, e4 and g4 tend to be the two most common gambits. But Staunton Gambit, I would say, is probably the most common. E4, pawn takes e4, knight to c3, knight to f6, bishop to g5, knight to c6, and white has the choice between d5, f3. Both look like they're reasonable plays. But knight to c6 is the most frequent response for black in this main line. So d5, knight to e5, queen to d4, knight to f7, and then basically, this bishop there has to be some action on this bishop. Either bishop takes f6 or h4. Both of those seem to work for white. So bishop takes, e takes, knight takes. Now, by the way, material is back to equal. Yeah. So this is an example of a Dutch, a Staunton Gambit. White gets an aggressive position, but with stable play and within the main lines, black encounters relatively safe, relatively safe position that's slightly better than equality. F5 is an option. I guess that's the most popular. F5, bishop to e7 are the two options for black. On, let's think. So on bishop to e7, I'm sort of curious about e6 being played here. I guess it's not playable though, because this knight and bishop are both positioned to take on e6. Here, white can castle, f4, d6, and yeah, white's just sort of playing. Basically, white is ahead. So I don't think this is the most dynamic response for black. This knight takes e4, and black has an eval in multiple different situations. So bishop to e7, I think, is less good probably than f5. F5 seems to make a more immediate threat to the center. Let's see. So on the f5 line, knight to g3, g6, bishop to c4, d6 or b5. But yeah, basically white's facing off against white's facing off against this king side. So b5 can be good for black. But yeah, interesting situation, and yeah, I guess this is probably the most aggressive response for black here. Bishop to b4, okay, c3. I don't know. I guess I would just say these openings are interesting. They, in terms of looking at other gambit lines for black or for white against the Dutch. I'm also kind of curious about this g4 line. This might be a little bit more narrow, but g4, e4, d6, knight to c3. This one, involves basically, stunting white's growth on f3 and h3. That tends to be something that's helpful for black here. So basically, I guess I would say just this gambit doesn't seem to provide much advantage for white. Aggressive attacks can come in with bishop to c4. Aggressive attacks can come in with bishop to d3, bishop to g5. I guess I would say, but yeah. The counter Dutch that those stunted lines were out of e4. So there are some very dangerous lines out of e4. Realistically, I could probably bring that up again, but I think that this e4, knight to c3, and threats on e4 tend to be pretty good for white. But yeah, so I mean, if black misplays this, so let's say for example black plays, or let's look at the most common misstep, and this is not by any means an uncommon misstep. d5 here. And basically, white has good advantages. Bishop takes f6, with queen to h5 coming next round. E takes f6 is good, or best for black. But queen to h5 forks this king and this pawn. So I would say this attack in itself, out of this Staunton gambit, probably happens I would say that white probably seals a winning position out of this 10% of the time at club level. So this is definitely an early pitfall that people fall into very frequently as black. But there's multiple things like this. So this is the first one, basically this bishop to g5. Hey, welcome Aphelion, thanks for joining the stream. So yeah, bishop to g5, queen to h5, and this fork on king and d5. But yeah, I guess I would say that is an error that can happen here. Bishop to g4 is by far the most common. d4 is definitely playable for black. In terms of improving here for black, I think e6 is possible. Knight takes, and then pressure on f6. Bishop to e7, bishop takes, and this is fairly tranquil. I mean, this is how black plays against this correctly. But I don't want to underestimate how basically I don't want to underestimate how frequently d5 gets played here. d5 is just an intuitive way to play this. It captures the center. And it's, it basically looks like a very natural place for this pawn to go. But bishop takes f6, e takes f6, and black basically loses out of that. So other missteps that black can have, g6, h4. This is a very aggressive line. Thank you very much. It's actually super helpful for you to ask these questions, Jack. But yeah, h4, and basically pressure h4, h5, d5, and h5 here. Bishop to g7, h6, and bishop to f8. This is a position, this by the way is still main line. I'm not sure necessarily how good this even is for white, but this is the type of situation where you've created a big spatial problem for white against black here. So this bishop on g5 is facing up against f6, and yeah, basically h4, h5, h6. That is pretty effective. That is a way to that is a way for basically white to press his advantage in this Staunton game. So anyways, let's see, bishop to g5, e6, knight takes, bishop to e7, and basically black's facing off aggressively against f6. This knight can go here, but yeah, I think after this this attack by white has been kind of successfully dealt with. So bishop to g5, knight to c6, d5. This also is a situation where white gets a sustained advantage. Knight to e5, queen to d4, and basically threats on this knight. But again, this is a successful response for white. I guess what I want to say is basically that it's an opening that can provide a lot of practical compensation for white. Bishop to g5, knight to c6, d5, knight to e5, queen to d4, and queen to e2. Sure, but basically black is looking fine. This opening should not be. Black should basically not be worried about this. The really dangerous lines come when black tries to play things that are too aggressive. An early d5 would do it. An early h6 would do it. G6, I'm sort of curious about. I think G6 is also kind of a popular move that that White has aggressive play against. So this this G6 move, H4, D5, H5. This is fine for Black. I mean, with accurate play, which is Bishop to F5 here, Black is fine. But White can still seal like basically you know, a lot. So by the way, this is you know, this is the main line. But White can play things along the lines of like so H4, H5 basically. Knight takes H5, Rook takes H5, Pawn takes H5, Queen takes H5. You know, that might not even be that good, to be completely honest. You know, I guess we can look at the eval, but the practical compensation that White's getting here is really dangerous. So I don't know. Bishop to F5 holds this position together. In this opening book, I assume that Bishop to F5 is the most popular choice. Let's take a look at Bishop to G7. This particular line too is one that comes up that that gets pretty that basically gives White a lot of practical compensation. H6, Bishop to F8, and yeah, this is pretty stunted. F3 instead. F3, Queen to D6, Queen to D2, Queen to G3. And ideas, you know, can include King to D1, but overall here, I think that that White is, you know, that White is good after this. King D1, Queen D6, Knight GE2. So, anyways, Bishop G7 is playing just to provoke White. Yeah, well, I mean, the thing about it is if he doesn't play Bishop to G7. So yeah, thank you very much for participating, Aphelion. So yeah, Bishop to F5, Bishop to G4. And Bishop to G4 here, Bishop to E2, G takes H5, Bishop takes, E takes, Bishop takes, Pawn takes, Queen takes. This line, I guess, is again probably fine for White. But the point is that if you know, Black plays some random move here, like, you know, the opening lines all seem to be ones where there's an immediate attack for Black. But on H5, if like anything other than this, so say, you know, Bishop to D7 or something. Pawn takes G6 is very strong for White. So basically, there are a number of ways that White can or the Black can play against this. But this Pawn takes G6, that is a successful way to advance White's position. So Black needs to come up with some response to that. Otherwise, it's just there. So, anyways, White needs to choose. You know, Black needs to choose a good choice. Yeah, right, exactly. Jack is Aphelion is a master. I strongly recommend, if anyone's interested, take a look at the FIDE online arena. The FIDE titles are available now online. You know, for many years, people needed to play. You know, people needed to play at a very high level for a very long time to get a FIDE title. But now that option has become available to everyone. So, you know, get one of the 12 titles that FIDE is offering, I would recommend. And if you can do that, then definitely, you know, I think it's a great option. I mean, you know, the concept of a FIDE title has been a very exclusive thing for a very long time. So if you can get one, then I would recommend getting one. Yeah, no, I think it's great. Basically, getting that, you know, getting that title, I think is definitely an interesting thing to do. And yeah, their servers interesting. But it is something that you can successfully do. You'll have that FIDE title for life, and that is something that I did and that Aphelion did. And I'm very happy to create more players titled by the International Chess Federation. If anyone else wants to, get an international recognition, international master title, I strongly recommend it. Anyways, so H4, Bishop to G7. Bishop to G7 is the best. H6, so this basically provoke H6, and then Bishop to F8 is provoked. F3 basically undermines the center. F3, Queen to D6, Queen to D2, Queen to G3, King to D1. This is another situation. Black kind of gets this aggressive play, but White is fine. Yeah, this is yeah, no. This is the Dutch Stoughton Gambit. Definitely, yeah, definitely go with that. You know, basically, yeah, Dutch Stoughton Gambit is what we're looking at, Lord Flows. But yeah, yeah, the next simul, by the way, is Tuesday at 8 during the 8 a.m. stream. If you guys can make it, that would be great. If you can't, then I'm not offended at all. But But I was going to try to see if we could get 20 people for the simul this week. I thought that could be fun, and yeah, that I think is a yeah, I think that is a good yeah, that brutal simul I don't know too much about, but I don't remember the checkmate. I assume you won, right? I can't remember who won, to be completely honest. I know Kathleen won, and I think Aphelion won, and I know... Were you one of the people who won, Jack Mac? If not, then you can... oh, okay. Well, if you can play again this week, you know, your chances... I think your chances may be better. I promise I will lose to everyone if they play in those long enough. But yeah, yeah, look forward to seeing you there if you can make the time, Jack Mac. It means a lot to me. So, anyways, looking at this, e4, pawn takes e4, knight to c3, knight f6. Bishop to g4 is better for white, and on bishop to g4, there's knight to c6, e6. Yeah, so knight to c6, d5, knight to e5, queen to d4. Knight to f7, and basically white is looking fine. You know, I don't think there's anything too, I don't think there's anything too scary here. I think it's just, I think basically h4 may be white's best possibility, but this is the line that that black plays, the black plays it correctly. g6 is a much sharper line, which offers white way better counterplay. So g6, h4, and yeah, I don't know, d5 I guess for black is the line. But white's about to start, basically some problems with this advanced pawn from h4 to h5. This just offers white a lot of practical compensation. So d5, h5, bishop to f5, and yeah, bishop takes f6, e takes f6, g4. Overall, I think white's just fine here. Yeah, basically h takes g6. Again, I'm surprised that the engine eval is this, this generous to black here. This seems to like black's position, but if you just look at this position, I guess it's a situation similar to the King's Gambit, where objectively speaking, black is fine, but you're basically going into situations in which white has a ton of practical compensation in the main line. So pawn takes h6, and then pawn threats on h7. And ideas like queen to d2, bishop e2, knight to e2 for white. So overall here, I think white is, it's a complicated situation. At club level, white wins this a good percentage of the time. This is just awkward and difficult way for white to play. If you look at this from black's position, it certainly doesn't feel like you're winning, in my opinion. So this is kind of the appeal of the Staunton Gambit. Just these kinds of basically long tactical, long orders of tactical play where there's many potential missteps for black. If you're assessing this position, I mean, what do you even do? Like, it's basically, King's Gambit. It's sort of King's Gambit-esque, right? Like, I guess probably bishop to g7 is the best here. But let's say bishop g7 looks optically like the best. But on bishop takes g7, rook takes g7, rook takes g7, h takes g7, and white has regained the advantage. So there's many missteps here, or there's many abilities to misstep. With this h4, h5, bishop to g7, if instead bishop to f5 on f5, yeah, no, it does though, right? I mean, this looks pretty dangerous to me. Basically, this is the main line, is my point. Is that the reason why people play the Staunton Gambit is that even though black is showing, better than equality here, white is, white has a great position. Now, the thing that made this a more aggressive line for black here, so pawn takes, knight c3, knight f6, f3. The reason why, basically on this, so bishop to g5 is next, c6 is an idea. But yeah, this idea, so bishop to g5, knight to c6, this idea is, which does not seem at all intuitive to me, is I think a better way for black to equalize. If you play g6, you introduce all these crazy lines with h4, h5. But I do think that g6 and bishop g7 seems like a very intuitive plan here for black. So h4, bishop to g7, and then h5. Yeah, I think overall here black is doing, basically this looks very good for, it looks very good for black to play this way. So bishop to g7 I think is good, castles is good. it's a playable line, but the margin for error for black is going to be consistently limited. H5. Now bishop f5 is a required single move. Bishop takes, pawn takes. Ideas like g4, sure, bishop to e6, but overall here I think this is this is basically a situation in which black has the superior position. Even with g4, bishop to e6, pawn takes g6. Even then, black is better. The important thing is to do something like playing queen to d7 and maintain defense on d5 and c7. But yeah, this is just, black is better by 4/10 of a pawn here. This is overall is a good position for black. White can play something like rook to h7, but, overall this position not really that, not really that promising for white. With optimal play. Yeah, right? This is why people play the Staunton Gambit. Like, odds are that people are going to play, like, queen to e7, basically queen to e7 facing off an h7, pawn takes h7, rook takes h7, queen takes h7. But yeah, so I think this here is a way better option is the best option for black. But white gets a ton of practical compensation here is the idea. So anyways, that's my point. That I think is the way, basically the way to refute the Staunton Gambit the most easily, I think, is not by playing bishop to g7. But we saw how much more complicated the bishop to g7 line it was. And on knight f6, bishop to g4, the main lines for black are like knight to c6, basically knight to c6 here. d5 is completely unplayable and yet played in a very large percentage of positions. But knight to c6, basically not really creating any hooks for white to attack on the king side is actually kind of a good conservative way to play this. On d5, you play knight e5 and don't be afraid to move the knight to f7. So, anyways, interesting stuff. Queen to d4, knight to f7, bishop takes, pawn takes, and yeah. This is basically the Staunton Gambit. Would you recommend the Dutch? It depends on your rating level. So the thing about the Staunton Gambit and the thing about, some of these crazy gambits in the Dutch, so basically, there was a time when I was about 17 or 1800, and I was playing the Dutch, and basically, white would play moves like g4, and I would have no idea how to play them as black, and then basically wind up in a situation where I was basically forced to take g4, and here again. Black is showing a minus 0.6 eval. So basically black has done way better than equalize here. Black is like winning. So my main point in responding to your question, Lord, is like what level are you at? How comfortable are you with actually like putting in the time on memorization? Because this, I would just get these kinds of gambit lines, these e4, g4 types of gambit lines against the Dutch, and it was enough to make me stop playing the Dutch, basically. I really hated playing against them, and they seem to be happening more frequently than I'd like. Yeah, there's lack of development. That too is a reasonable point. But like g6, bishop to g7, d5, knight to f6. Yeah, you're right. You're basically not playing in the center. d5 offers a much more straightforward route to developing your bishops and knights, and is in general in the center much more solid. So, yeah, I guess what I would say there, Jack, is that, or basically, there are some challenges with developing the Dutch. But the thing that I found to be the biggest deterrent was actually just these really aggressive opening lines by white. They are really annoying to play against. I also had this crazy game where I lost to like a 2700 over the board in a Dutch Leningrad line, and just I seem to have been getting many quick losses as black out of the Dutch against ultra aggressive lines. And I didn't really want to spend the time learning how to play them because I wanted to just basically, play something fundamental that would generate a tactical position. So if you do play the Dutch, you are going to have to learn, you're going to have to learn either e4 or g4 for white. One of those, both of those two will come up against you, and both of those, if you misplay them, will be very dangerous for black. So g4, pawn takes g4, e4, e6, d6, knight to c3. And basically here, you're defending this pawn on g4, but basically black is better, but in an aggressive position. So in like this situation, you probably play something like knight to f6, and white plays h3, e5. I mean, you can sort of work your way out of this, but it always felt like it basically always feels like you're getting attacked out of e4 and g4 in the Dutch. I would say if you learn the Dutch, don't underestimate the possibilities of g4 and e4 getting played. It's generally a playable opening, and the reason why I ask what your rating is for context is because at a higher level, people don't play the Staunton Gambit, people don't play this g4 line against you anymore. So like if you're playing at an expert level, right, people rarely play the Staunton Gambit or rarely play this g4, Gambit. It's equally dangerous at that level, but, they sort of assume that you know it well, and then they don't play it against you. So, the main point is that, if you're playing it, especially at club level, you have to learn the g4 and e4 responses and be comfortable with that as black, because you will face those with some frequency. So, cool. Yeah, good work, Lord Flows. How's the tactical study going? So g4, pawn takes g4. Ideas like d5 for black, knight to f6, c6. Knight to d7, e5. Black will try to turn this into a game where he, basically captures some level of control of the center. But overall here, black is basically playing solidly. So d5, queen d3, knight to f6, h takes g4, bishop takes, and black is black's a pawn up. So, anyways, bishop h3, queen d7, bishop takes, queen takes, and I think black is okay. I think the neutralizing, if black can successfully neutralize, he'll be all right. But black needs to be very careful to do that. So anyways, this e4 is the Staunton Gambit. Let's take one more look. This f3 line, is there anything interesting in this? That's what I was sort of curious about. Yeah, thank you very much, GM Shadow. Thanks very much for being here. It's great. I'm really happy that people are getting something out of this. I get to learn a lot, to be honest. So, for me, this is just fun. So, e takes f3, knight takes f3, knight to f6, and basically, white is up by a good amount here. So, here, or this gambit actually plays out fairly well. After e takes f3, white still secures an advantage. This is probably a line that you should learn how to play as black as well. Maybe for black better is d5. So on f3 here, e takes f3 is the most common. Best is considered to be d5, which again, feels very loose. But the thing is, you had no opportunity to avoid this as black, basically. The Staunton Gambit is better to be accepted. So, if you're playing this, if someone plays the Staunton Gambit against you, you're probably obligated to take, because, so e4 and d6 is worse, or e6 is worse. So basically, these situations both lead in white securing a good position. But the issue here is that at no point if you're taking on e4 can you avoid this f3 move. d5 is better than pawn takes, but again, you're in just this really uncomfortable, aggressive position where you are technically fine as black, but we'll have to face a lot of tough things. Yeah, so Blackmar's second gambit. I guess the Staunton Gambit is implied to be the first one here. So I guess the Staunton Gambit would be the first. Blackmar's would be the second, I think is what they're getting at with that. But again, I didn't know what that was called, even though I've played against this before. So f3, pawn takes f3, d5, knight to f6, all options for black. So yeah, e takes f3, knight takes f3, knight to f6, knight to c3, and black is basically fine here, I think. Ideas could include g6, bishop to g7, but yeah, overall, this is, I guess I would say this is a very aggressive play. Knight to c3 seems like an error here. Knight to c3 is, yeah, so knight to c3 here seems to equalize according to this eval. What's really interesting is that the eval is suggesting some non-book moves for white here. That's always interesting. Makes me want to study the opening more. But yeah, knight to c3 seems to be better than knight to c3 seems, which is the opening book move, seems to be better than this, or seems to be worse than other lines that the engine is suggesting. Like the engine is suggesting moves like bishop to d3, bishop to g5. It was looking at knight to g5 for a while, but maybe it found a refutation. knight to g5. I mean, there's a lot of really aggressive moves that white can play. Knight to c3 probably isn't necessary. In fact, it's not. I mean, you can kind of go with after. You can play bishop to d3. You can play bishop to g5. But overall, white is going to be in a pretty good situation and have a lot of practical aggressive threats against black. So I think bishop to g5, c3, bishop to d3, all of that seems reasonable for white. So, anyways, I think that's pretty good for pretty good for white. Knight to c3, and then ideas like d5 could potentially be good for black. e6 could potentially be good for black, and e6, bishop d3, bishop e7, bishop to g5. I don't know. Black seems fine here. Playable moves like knight to c6, playable moves like castles. Overall here, I think, yeah, black is fine. I mean, ideas. White's going to have ideas to attack, and white's going to play things like bishop takes f6. Probably, I don't know. Here, if I was white, I would probably castle queenside. But basically, black is fine out of this aggressive play by white. There's just no tactical put away here, so. Anyways, Stun Gambit provides an interesting resource. This F3 Gambit too looks interesting. This potentially, if you learned this line extremely well, could offer you some opportunities at club level. So yeah, white's just looking fine. I don't think there's really anything too terrible here. Knight to F6 and knight to C3 or bishop to D3. I think white is just fine after this. So, anyways, that's what I would go with, and yeah, I think that's a better. Basically, that's a better play for white. White can also play c4. White can play bishop to g5, and I think white's comfortable. So, anyways, I think that's a way, basically an interesting gambit, an interesting play for white. And there's a lot of theory there. Both f3 is a line, knight c3, knight f6, bishop to g5 is a line. A little curious about f3 on this move. f3 seems to be more popular later. d5, f takes, d takes, but in all of these situations, black can't duck this successfully. Black is basically basically black is playing g6, bishop g7, and this overall strong, these strong plays by white going up against black. This tends to be, black is fine, but white has a lot of practical compensation is the point. So that was enough to scare me at 1800 level away from the Dutch, to be honest. Stun Gambit and that G4 Gambit, both of those, led to very quick and memorable losses for me as black. So they were enough to basically take me out, out of that theory, to be honest. So, if you play the Dutch is interesting. The Dutch leads to closed conservative positions in most situations, but white also has the alternative to turn it into very crazy, aggressive King's Gambit type structures. So, yeah, up to you. But that is something that you will probably need to know how to do if you're playing the Dutch. All right, on to the next one. This is a TK's game. And the thing I want to, so we can take a look and let's look at the report for this. But what I kind of want to look at here is this, how aggressive this opening is. Or basically I want to take a look at the opening. Like, this game looks volatile. I mean, you can look at a chart like this and you can pretty comfortably say, like, okay, this volatility led to the decision here. Basically 1.47 swinging to 2.67. That's a swing of about 4 points. So yeah, that kind of swing, right, is enough to indicate that the game's decided on tactical issues. There's earlier volatilities, but what I really want to study in this the game is the opening. So this is the Steiner variation. Basically, against against Caro-Kann, C4 is the Panov variation, but against E6, it's the Steiner variation of the French. Black still often plays d5. That's the most common move for black. c5 transposes this into basically into a Sicilian with a Maroczy bind, like a closed Sicilian with Maroczy bind. So that kind of makes it an interesting, that makes it an interesting situation. Also can transpose into the English opening. Yeah, so Steiner, right, exactly. e6, c4, c5, and basically opportunities here. Knight to f3, knight to c3. Those look good for white. But yeah, d5 or c5 is the most common play by black, and white should have good responses to each. So d5, that's an idea. D5, e takes d5, e takes d5, d4, and white ends up in a situation where white is up by a little, but not very much. This is the Monte Carlo variation of the French, by the way. Lots of different transpositions. Let's see what happened in this game. C5, so this is going to turn into something that looks somewhere between an English, or it could transpose into the English. It could transpose into the the Sicilian. Knight to f3, g6. G6 looks like an error here. On g6, d4, and basically white is winning. So, I think g6 is a passive move for black here. Black can basically challenge the center much more effectively with knight to f6. I want to look at the evals for the different options. I'm also sort of, I think basically this kind of demonstrates a good positional principle. G6 in general doesn't pair well with e6. If you play both of these, you're going to have sustained weaknesses on your dark squares as black. The white bishop, the white dark squared bishop, can basically play bishop to g5 and really try to create issues for you, with your king safety and with pins on queen d8 as well. So g6 is a big error. This is actually really important. So I think this is actually a really good instructional moment, and that's why I wanted to take a look at it. But this g6 move, yeah, hey, welcome, Master. Thank you very much for joining the stream. So this g6 is important to understand from an instructional perspective. It really weakens the dark squares. I understand why it's played. It's played in order to fianchetto this bishop to g7, but the combination of this weak e6 and this weak g6 is an issue. Yeah, well, it does, right? D4 here, and it turns in. Well, I mean, it doesn't. It needs g6 to be the dragon. On chess.com, does my name and title appear on the leaderboard? Generally, yes, I think. Yeah, after g6. Yeah, the only thing about it is that g6, similar to the Sicilian, g6 is not paired with e6 very frequently. Like, we can take a look at g6, but I'll show you sort of in the Sicilian. We can later, yeah, we can do this. So e4, c5, knight to f3, g6, say knight to c3, or d4. I guess d4. No, or c4. Say c4, just to make it the same. Bishop to g7, knight to c3, and then e6 would be a rough play here. Like, e6 basically weakens this diagonal to the point. It's the same basic concept in this Sicilian, where it does look like the Sicilian dragon, but the issue is that e6 is also a bad move in the dragon Sicilian. Again, for the same reason, making these dark squared dark squares weak and available to be attacked. So I guess I would say that, this basically d4, bishop to g5, and strength on g5 against d8. That's really where it is, and yeah. So knight to c3, e6. Ideas for white can include d4, but pairing e6 with g6 in the Sicilian just ends up being bad for white. So anyways, knight to c3, knight to c6, knight to f3, g6. And here white's showing an eval advantage of 1.5. Aphelion is FIDE titled. Aphelion is an ACM. He's the first person who got an arena title out of as a result of this stream. But Aphelion is a titled master, master of Luck Games. So base your expectations. Temper your expectations. But yeah, your Aphelion is a titled FIDE player. Just to be clear. So if anyone's interested in that, I can go into my whole thing about talking about how the FIDE arena works. But Aphelion is a FIDE titled master, and he will have that FIDE titled master for life. Yeah, no worries. No, actually, the interesting thing, again, we can talk about this, is, if you have any interest in getting a master title as well, Master of Luck games, you can always sign up on the FIDE Arena. The FIDE Arena offers titles. That's sort of what I was getting at with talking about this. I also think it's great if people can join, and get master titles, and I can promote that on the stream. I'm always super in favor of that. But yeah, here's the thing. FIDE has 12 titles. So basically, Master of Luck games, you can look at this FIDE titled page, right? And you can find on here, the traditional four. This traditional four: GM, IM, FM, and CM. Okay, so that's four titles there. Those were the original ones. But FIDE has also added 8 others. But the ones that I'm interested in are these arena titles. Basically, you can become a FIDE master with play on this FIDE online arena. It costs 25 euros a year, which isn't ideal. And the master title also costs a few more euros. But if you want to become a titled master of Luck games, but that's the thing. Master of Luck games, you can get a FIDE title, like if you want. This is a way to get FIDE titles. You can get a FIDE title, become a FIDE master. Aphelion is one. That's his rating. But for life, he is a FIDE titled FIDE master. That is something that, regardless of what else he does in his chess, in his chess learning, he has become a FIDE titled master. And if you have any interest in do that, I think it's great. I don't know how long this is going to last, to be completely honest, but I think it's great. So definitely, I got my FIDE AGM recently. I thought that was pretty cool. And if you're interested in that route, I think it's awesome. I think it's really cool that you can get a FIDE Arena title. But again, that's up to you. Well, I mean, historically, yes, but also more specifically, this requires this basically requires a play above a certain level on a this requires play above a certain level on the FIDE Arena. FIDE Arena access is 25 euros a year, but you can basically get a FIDE title, a master title, one of the 12 masters that, yes, and of course you do pay for it. It costs less than the average FIDE tournament that I play in, but yeah, the answer is yes. Yes, the FIDE International Chess Governing Body offers this, offers these arena titles. And I am now an AGM, having gotten my first FIDE Master title in the last 2 weeks or so. In addition to being an NM, from the United States Chess Federation, I am now an AGM from the from FIDE. So, anyways, no, I mean, I wouldn't say feel no pressure. I would say feel no pressure, but for me, I just am so excited about this this possibility. I think it's kind of funny that you can get a FIDE title now. Basically for a very long time, FIDE titles were something that you really had to put in a lot of time for. But now you can just get them on the arena. So that is a thing that you can do. And if you want to become an official FIDE titled master, you can definitely do that. So FIDE titled masters, this is a route in. This is a way that you can do it. And sounds good to me. I got mine. So anyways, on to the next idea. We're still looking at this basically E4 C4 idea. Steiner against the French. D4. D4 basically is a reasonable way to play. This basically breaks open the center. D4, pawn takes, knight takes, bishop to G7, and white's looking fine here. Probably knight DB5, knight to D6, and white overall I think is pretty solid in this position. Bishop to E3, okay. But yeah, basically these sustained weakness on these light squares, you can get those. So bishop to E3, knight to F6, knight takes, pawn takes C6, and white ideas include E5, threatening that knight, F4, knight to E7, and I mean basically this this exploits these dark squares in a way that what probably wasn't the most obvious one, but this again works on that weakness that's created by E6 and C6. and overall the weak squares that black has become a serious liability. Castles, bishop to d3, rook to e8, knight to e4, knight to f5, castles, and yeah, white's up by about 3.5, 4 pawns here. Cool. b3, bishop f8, and yeah, I think white's got about 3 pawn advantage. Rook c2 is a pretty serious blunder. Rook to c2, and black can basically play bishop to d3. This bishop to d3 causes a lot of trouble. Like, there's not really a great place for this rook to go now. And now you have basically created defense on this f5 square. You've also created the opportunity to post on bishop to e4 for as long as this knight's pinned to this queen. So yeah, I think that's a little bit better for black. On this line, bishop to d3. Rook cc1, queen takes a2, and black's getting a lot of play on white's, in white's territory now. So that was an error. Basically, the correct move here was queen to g2. With queen to g2, you have opportunities to basically, hold on to this pawn with a discovered check. I sort of like black's play here, though. I think black's play here kind of makes sense. Ideas like, a3 and b4, those end up being pretty strong for white. But yeah, knight to f6, g4, queen takes, king to g7. White's way up. At this point, black's threats have not gotten to be effective enough, and white is basically in a situation where he has an open attack on the black king side. Black needs to be very careful to deal with this in a tactically correct way. Ideas like potentially, I don't know, bishop takes f5, rook to e3 looks pretty rough. But yeah. Rook h8, bishop takes, pawn takes, rook to c2, rook b d8, rook to d1, rook to h3, and white's up here by about 4 pawns. This discovery seems to work out well, but white's the one, basically because black didn't push aggressively enough on this position. With the more aggressive bishop to d3, black would really have a set of pieces that are all kind of involved in attacking white. But because of the more passive rook to d8, white was able to just get basically full play on black's, on black's king side without there ever being much of a counterplay by black. So, yep, looks like wins for black. Rook takes h2, king takes h2, and black has a mate in 3 about. So yeah, so this played out. This provided a good tactical resource for black, but again, super volatile game. We can just look at this, and I'm going to recommend tactics training to both players. Where can we think more about the themes of this game, I guess is my question. The most instructive part of this game, in my mind, is showing off how, e6 and g6 really don't pair well together. If they're both played, that creates problems. This knight can go to b5 and play on d6. This bishop can play to g5. If bishop blocks to e7, then knight to g5, knight to d6 become a problem. But just sustained weakness and making the dark squared bishop for white a lot more powerful. I think that's the issue that pairing g6 with e6 creates. d4, pawn takes, knight takes, bishop to g7, bishop to e3. And here, you're kind of in a situation where white is fine. White can play knight takes c6. That's an idea. But black's pawn structure is not ideal. Black's development is kind of awkward, and this bishop can face off against this d8 on the g5 to d8 diagonal. So knight takes, pawn takes, e5, knight to g8, and white's basically pushing here. So f4. Knight to e7, bishop to c5, but white basically capitalizes on this opportunity. This early bishop to c5 facing off on this diagonal, this played out very well for white. Castles, bishop to d3, rook to e8, knight to e4. And white's basically better. It's just, again, this diagonal is really powerful. It's difficult for black to threaten on it. Black could play bishop to f8, but then knight to f6 would become a legitimate threat. So, white has done a good job of, sustaining an attack on this dark squared diagonal. Castles, h5, rook to c1, queen to a5. This is, yeah, this continues to be good for white. And basically it is all good for white, you know, until black has opportunities to get into white's position. Capitalizing on this, I think probably here, you know, this is about as wide as the situation ever got. But you could instead play knight takes h5, pawn takes h5, queen takes h5, and have your queen like well into the black position. So that's better. G4, pawn takes, queen takes, and white is fine. Knight to h5 is probably best for white, but overall here, this is you know, this is a situation where white is winning. White needs to do something though to keep like the bishop off of d3 and the queen off of a2. What we saw in this game basically is that, you know, letting black have all these pieces on the white side, you know, really needed to be something that white paid attention to. This got super dangerous, and e6 was a huge blunder. Instead, you know, if white plays queen to f6, that's fine. If white plays rook to e1, that's fine. But if e6 gets played, then rook takes h2 equalizes, and then king takes h2 is the biggest blunder in the game. So overall, you know, what I would say, TK, is yeah, definitely thank you for sending the game, but the points of this. Hey, welcome, Lauren. Thank you very much for joining the stream. So yeah, e6, king takes h2, queen takes f2, and black is better. So overall, you know, white played a good game, got a good attack going, but there just needed to be a little bit more caution. You know, rook to e1 threatening this queen was a better idea. But e6 and rook takes a2, this needed to be hey, I do it for, you know, I mostly do it for me, Lauren. So you know, that's one of the things that's helpful. It's I do it to study, and I do it with the idea that that chess lessons should be free and available to everyone. But yeah, I highly recommend streaming if you're if you're, you know, a master. But yeah, chess lessons can be made free, so they should be free. And these lessons are also great for me. I learn a lot of stuff. So, anyways, very happy with this. You know, even it doesn't really matter to me how many people show up either. Like, it would be great if it was more, but honestly, I'm learning stuff. This is fun for me to do. So, anyways, knight takes c6, e5, knight to g8, f4. And white's got a big advantage. So the moves to reevaluate for white. I thought white capitalized well on these dark squared dark squares for black. And then the real errors for white here: queen takes, rook to f8, queen to b5. But basically allowing this rook to play, you know, to play h1 or rook takes h2, which wouldn't have been allowed if rook to e1 was instead played. If rook to e1 was instead played, then basically white is fine. Rook to e1, and this queen needs to respond to the threat. So if the queen goes there, rook takes, king takes, white is fine. But allowing this rook to takes h2 to be responded to, or to be played without an active threat, is enough to lose for white. I'm sort of wondering, I guess probably queen takes f8 was never practically playable. But overall, as a concept, what I would say is that that TK would probably benefit from paying more attention to aggressive threats coming in. You know, he basically isn't attacking quick enough to ignore this threat entirely, and ignoring this threat entirely cost him the game. So that was the issue there. Anyways, interesting game, very cool, and yeah, on to the next one. Next game is from. Next game is from Kiro. Cool. So Kiro is playing black here. Yeah, so Kiro's playing black. He's playing Rosen, I think, in a simul. d4, d5, this is the London system. Knight to f6, e3, c5, okay. So here basically c5 and black has played his most aggressive move. We've looked over this position, basically London system with e3. We've seen this a few times. Black's most aggressive option is c5. It's also played the most frequently. You know, again, you know, these are the types of situations where I kind of play c6. The question for Lauren is, you have that specific book, and Um, I think the method is probably. I think you're asking me basically. You're playing through a grandmaster book, and you're asking what what method should you use to solve it. That candidate move, that's kind of an interesting. That's basically an interesting question. I guess I would say there that you're so you're looking at candidate moves, and you're not finding that particularly helpful. I guess that's interesting. I've heard they're pretty solid. But yeah, the candidate, yeah, looking at those candidate moves, I guess. I mean, to be honest, I don't study that. That's a very effective way to study. So I think it's a great way to be studying. I think that's, when you're doing your study, coming up with candidate moves at a conscious level is really good. When I do tactics, or when I do more slower tactics, you're not finding it. I mean, you could force that. You could brute force that one, right? Like you could basically say like, I'm gonna write down all of the candidate moves, right? Like that would be, you could write down enough moves that you would see the right move, and you could spend enough time on it that you would, So your candidate moves are wrong in that assessment. So yeah, I don't know. Good question, Lauren. But yeah, I guess I would say make more candidate moves. But yeah, maybe I don't. You're asking me a situation that I'm not super familiar with. I kind of don't know the puzzles in the book that you're referring to, and I don't know, what potential candidate moves would be. Yeah, I think it's a good method, to be honest. The first thing is, I would take I would take a grandmaster's advice over my own. I have a certain set of capabilities. Of them, I defer to the higher level chess players for that type of thing. So yeah, the question is, I would defer to the GM's judgment on that over mine. But it does sound like something that would intuitively work. Like if you're actually like doing the preparation and coming up with the candidate moves, yeah, feel free. Feel free to write down the candidate moves, see what's going on there, and yeah. C5, knight to F3, C6 or E6, knight D2, knight C6. Basically here, I think black is fine. This situation, white has not responded to this threat. So C5 basically it's similar to the Queen's Gambit, declined as white, but black's just kind of develop in a healthy way. And white is basically, white could try C4 potentially, but basically, black is just going to kind of develop as if it was the Queen's Gambit declined for white. So bishop to D7, bishop to E7 probably, castles, queen to B6, queen to A5. Those are all kind of candidate moves for black. This is really pretty intuitive. Now it just looks like the, it basically looks like the semi-Slav. Bishop D6, bishop G3, bishop takes, pawn takes, bishop to D7, and yeah, queen to C7. All this seems to make sense. Knight takes, pawn takes, knight to E8, castles, and basically black is. I guess I would say that black is sort of comfortable here. D4 playing off against C3. That seems like probably a good plan for black. But yeah, black's development is a little bit quiet. That's the only thing that I would say about this situation. So let's look closer at Kiro's game. So Kiro plays the aggressive C5. I actually really like this move. I think this is the most aggressive way to play for black, and yeah, you might as well. I mean, if white's giving you the opportunity to become the person who's offering the Queen's Gambit basically, then I think it's worthwhile to do it. E6, knight to D2, knight to C6, C3. And yeah, basically black can play bishop to D6, pawn can take on D4, and yeah, e takes D4, bishop D6, bishop to G3. Overall here, I think white's just in good shape. You might want to play bishop takes G3 and queen to B6, but black's gonna be fine. I don't know. Let's look at the long-term strategy here. I think black will probably do well with attacking on the queen side here. I think a minority attack here, probably, A6, B5, B4. Overall, that should be good. I think that should play out well for black. So I think I'd recommend that as the long-term strategic play. Also, you have this open C file. The C3 pawn's not particularly vulnerable, but developing your rook to a semi-open file could be helpful. So yeah, bishop to d7, rook to c8, a6, b5, knight a5, knight c4. That's kind of the theme that I would expect, for black here. White's not really going to get much going on the king side, I don't think. So yeah. All right, castling queen side is interesting because this does actually not. I mean, this is not the plan that I would have expected here. Now, now I don't really. Now I guess black's play is probably in the center with moves like d4. Yeah, so d4 I think probably is the best move for black. Bishop to c6 could be helpful. Bishop to a4 could be helpful. Queen to a5, knight to c7. All of that seems like a good play for black. f6, knight f3, pawn knight takes, and yeah, this was. But these were tactical errors. So from this point, I actually think you've played a pretty solid game as black. This basically, this is an opening line. Bishop to d6 is not as common as knight to h5, but okay, sure, whatever. Bishop d7, bishop d3, queen e2. Here, I would just say that black is, black is fine. He's holding out basically in an equalish position, and it's not until things actually get tactical that actual problems start coming up. So knight to f3, pawn takes e5, knight takes e5, and white's got some very good threats. f7 is hard to defend, and this h7 pawn is very overloaded. So knight to d6 is probably best for black. Knight to f6 I think is much worse. So knight to f7, rook f8, rook takes, knight takes, rook takes. This just isn't good for black. So the tactical improvements here, I guess. Pawn takes e5 was kind of proactively played. You could have just held on to this tension here as black. I understand it because I understand wanting to get your knight out. But basically, having this f6 pawn threaten on e5, having this f6 pawn threaten on g5, this ends up playing out well for black. So yeah, that's what I would do. I would go with h6, a6, b5. Those are the types of moves that are kind of more consistent with probably h6. H6 is getting recommended by the engine, but I think H6 basically, removes this pawn which was getting very heavily attacked, and then on pawn takes f6 you can play pawn takes f6 and maintain black's control of the center. With this proactive pawn takes e5, I understand it because I understand the reasoning is to get your knight out to d6 or to f6, but the white basically takes complete control of the center after knight takes d5. After knight takes d5, knight to d6, and white's just up by a lot. So knight f6, knight f7, rook f8, rook takes h8. Overall here, white's good. Maybe a6, b5, b4 could be good for black, but this position down in exchange with a big threat on your kingside pawns, this just isn't playable for black. I know you're playing in IM here, so this probably doesn't go anywhere. But actually it does. So queen to d4, queen takes d4, and you actually have equalized here. So yeah, rook to e3, king there, rook to e4, and yeah, I think basically here white is fine again. But there actually was a scary moment in there where white had almost equalized. So white made some pretty serious errors in this assessment, and black with his knight and pawn actually got some pretty good play. Rook f4, knight e4. Let's see rook e1 though, because rook f1 was what was played. Rook f1, rook e3 defending the pawn. King to c1 or king to c2, knight to e4, rook to c2, rook takes d5. Okay, sure. Basically, this situation for white is fine. This is gonna end up being a win for white. I think. I don't think black will be able to neutralize things. F2. So this sideline F2, F6, pawn takes, and yeah, black looks fine. So, and going through this game, Kiro, the places that I would pay the most attention to, I think this all actually was completely fine. The opening, no issues. The real error came with opening up the situation. F6, and then pawn takes E5. Really helped white. Giving white center control was more than black could afford, and it was basically not necessary. Black could instead play h6, and then on pawn takes f6, pawn takes f6, and things would be fine. So, yeah, I guess that's what I would say. Pawn takes e5, knight takes e5, knight f6, and yeah, white's fine. White's got no challenges. It sort of was misplayed by white to let it get back to equality, but I don't think it ever got to the point where there were actually any legitimate chances for black. I think black could always sort of shut things down. Anyways, really interesting game. But yeah, just I would think conceptually about allowing that that knight to take on e5. When you basically play pawn takes e5, I understand it in the context of wanting to get developed. But you have too many other problems that need to. This basically causes problems for black. It really gives up your center control. Your center control here is disputed. Like, if you can end up with a pawn here on f6 threatening on e5, that's a situation where I think that you could get, or where you could basically be okay. Then d5, d4, or e5, e4. I think that could end up being good for black, but yeah, I guess holding on to the center here is probably something that you want to do. Cool, yeah, no problem. No problem, Aphelion. Thank you very much for joining the stream. Knight takes e5, knight to f6, knight to f7, rook f8. Overall here, white wins. So that was the move. You didn't proactively need to play pawn takes e5. If you wanted to further your development, definitely start with h6 and clear out the hanging pawn first. Then maybe, then maybe, I don't know, I'm looking for a better developing plan. It's not so easy. It's understandable that you chose pawn takes e5. It's not so easy to find a square for the knight. But maybe pawn takes e5. Yeah. Yeah, how are you going to get that knight out? Queen to b6, knight to c7 could do it, potentially. But overall, black should be fine. So, anyways, really interesting situation, really interesting game, and thank you very much for sending Akira. The big issue was taking proactively on e5. You may have had to play other kind of constrained moves here, but definitely pawn takes e5, allowing the knight to secure permanent, basically permanent posting on e5 was not the correct idea. It is tricky though. Maybe I guess h6. h6 and I guess see what white plays. h6, pawn takes f6, pawn takes f6. But yeah, that's my opinion. I think that's your best way to do this as basically your best way to do this as black, and I think if you do that, you'll end up in a better situation. Queen to a5 facing off against a2, knight to c7, b5, b4. That seems like a good play for black. Or the best play for black. But yeah, the knight on e8 is kind of stuck and weak on that square. It's going to take a while to fix that. Maybe queen to c6 and knight to c7, potentially. But yeah, black's situation is already kind of constrained. Anyways, that's the main error. Pawn takes e5, not good. Let the knight take the center and become a huge problem. So, anyways, that's what I would say there. Interesting game. Thank you for sending it, Kiro. I'm happy to look at it, but I don't know. I don't know exactly what game you're referring to be completely honest. But yeah, feel free to send it in. I'm happy to look at it. I don't like looking at my own wins. I always feel like looking at your own wins is kind of a ridiculous exercise. So especially if I lost, please send it. Okay, so here's Tapas's game. Basically d4. So this is the Albin counter gambit. d4, d5, c4, e5. In terms of popularity, counter gambit is well down the list. So e5 here. Mainline response for white, d takes e5, and on d takes e5, d4. So this is the Albin counter gambit. These types of things I think are good to memorize, but basically pawn takes e5, d4. This is the way that the Albin counter gambit is played. In this game, I think white is up by about a pawn. Okay, cool. Sure. d4, knight f3, knight c6, g3, knight ge7, bishop to g2, knight g6, and black is holding. So black has defensive threats on d4. Black can play things like c5. Black can play things like b4. Black can play things like bishop to g4. But overall, black has a good center control here. So castles, knight gx5, knight b2, bishop b7, b3, castles, bishop to b2. And yeah, I think this ends up being good for black. Knight takes, bishop f6, queen d2, bishop to g4, And yeah, you know, white's basically up by half a pawn. This situation, I guess I would say, is you know, is good for white. You know, black never really kind of got much out of that gambit. I don't know. The development for white was not stunted enough to make this that good for black. On knight f3, this is the best that black ever got, I think, or in this opening. On knight f3, e4 is the move. So this is good to know. You know, e4 actually is better here. Knight to c6 getting suggested by the engine. That's sort of surprising. That seems to give white a bigger advantage. But I would say here after knight to f3, e4, and black will have you know, his option of relatively bad choices. E4, knight to d2, but basically you know, white is fine. So anyways, knight fd2, c6, knight to c3, knight to f6, and black is you know, black is okay. I guess better here was e3, bishop to d6, but I don't know, whatever. Knight to f3, bishop b4, bishop d2, bishop takes, knight takes, e4. The e4 came eventually. After this, you know, black has a great opportunity. So e4, knight to e5 was not correct. With that in mind, f6, I think, wins the knight, right? f6, queen a4, c6. Yeah, you won the knight as black, and black should now be winning. Let's see if it ever got any closer, but... yeah, looks fine. Yeah, all right, so black converts. So never really shifted after that, but this is the Albin counter gambit, e5, and then knight to c3, as opposed to pawn takes c4. On knight to f3, e4 is the move, e4, and then knight fd2, c6, knight to c3, knight to f6, e3, bishop to e7. Overall, I think this ends up being pretty good. Bishop to e7 is fine, but yeah, basically that's the idea. So e5, knight to f3, bishop to b5, bishop to d2, bishop takes, knight takes, e4. Cool. Yeah. So this is that opening. But anyways, knight to e5 was an error. f6 immediately wins the game. So interesting. Let's look more at this. D4, D5, C4, C6. Okay, right. But on the Albin counter gambit, on the Albin counter gambit, C4, E5, D takes E5, D4, and black is basically better. This idea for white, knight to F3, bishop to F4. You know, there's multiple options here. But accepting the gambit is better. Let's look at the non-accepting gambit lines. E3, I guess, is one of them. On E3, white is up by half a pawn. On C takes D5, queen takes D5, D takes E5, queen takes D1. And, you know, black's up by about 0.5 to 0.6. Makes sense. Yeah, king takes D1, knight to C6, knight to F3, bishop to G4. Overall here, I think black is just better. But yeah, up, you know, basically accepting the gambit seems to be almost necessary, which is kind of interesting. Lets me learn a little bit about this theory. Knight to C3, C6. This probably isn't that much better for black, yeah. So knight to C3, I guess, is okay. Is an okay way to not accept that gambit. But yeah, interesting. D takes, D4, knight to F3, knight to C6, G3, knight Ge7. And yeah, here, you know, bishop to G2 could be good, bishop to F4 could be good, but white is fine. Bishop G5, H6, bishop takes. I don't know. Yeah, it looks like equalized about. White's options: G3, A3, BND2, bishop to F4. 4 options for white. G3, knight Ge7, bishop to G2, knight to G6, castles, knight G takes E5, knight D2, And yeah, I guess I would say overall here, this basically simplifying in the center, and yeah, bishop to e7, sure. b3, castles, bishop to b2, knight takes, knight there. Overall, I guess I would just say white is solid. This never really offered that much for black, to be honest. Yeah, this isolated queen's pawn seems a bit vulnerable. Bishop takes, e4, knight to f, or knight to e5, f6. Sure. Yeah. Overall, this game was sort of simple. I mean, honestly, I don't think there was that much in terms of, in terms of improving this for white, or sorry, improving this for black. I mean, if the game's getting decided on move 6, things look pretty solid for black. I don't know exactly what black was interested in having me analyze here, to be completely honest. But I don't know, whatever. We got to learn a little bit about the Albin counter gambit. Bishop to b4, bishop takes, e6, f6. Yeah, this line in general, knight to f3. Knight to f3, knight to c6, d takes, d4. Black is fine. So d4, yeah, basically this d4 idea. I don't know. No idea. But a3. A3 is an idea, but yeah, A3, G3, BND2, bishop to F4, all options for white. So G3, knight to E7, bishop to G2, knight to G6, castles, knight takes, and yeah, black has simplified, but this position offers no challenges for white exactly. Options are bishop to E7, I guess. Knight f3. Overall, I don't think white's threatened by anything here. I think this is pretty, this is pretty bland. Honestly, just because this game was sent, I think we can wrap up a few minutes early tonight. I think basically, unless we want to study Albin counter gambit theory for a while longer, it's sort of, I don't know, this game in particular, f6, threatening this knight. Nothing in particular, nothing too big there. C6, and yeah, I guess I would say black is just better. So yeah, no, I mean I'm definitely going to continue doing this. Big picture. But yeah, no, I've no 0%. But cute though. It is, I mean, I don't know. I guess I would say, unless I don't understand what you're saying, move on from which part are you referring to? Just I didn't understand exactly what you were saying, Lauren. No, I'm very happy doing this, to be completely honest. Oh, okay, from this game. Got it. Oh, okay. So yeah, knight f5, castles, queen to e6. But yeah, black's fine here. So yeah, I don't know. But yeah, let's move on from this game. Let's call it a night. Next stream is at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning. This game was not too... hey, thank you very much for the follow, yes sir. Appreciate it. But yeah, no, I'm very happy to do these streams. Chess, basically chess lessons are gonna be free for sure. So I'm very happy to push things in that direction, and we'll continue to push things in that direction. So anyways, that's what I'm thinking, and yeah, appreciate it. Thanks a lot, Lauren. Appreciate it. Have a good one.